Today is Good Friday, and our hymn for today is The Old Rugged Cross. I want to reflect upon the hymn and the providence behind it, and then the hymn and the paradoxes in it, and then the hymn and the price paid for it. The providence behind the hymn. The words were written, the tune was composed back in 1912, 1913 by the American preacher George Bennard. Born in Ohio in 1887, he was raised in Iowa. When he was just in his teens, his father, who is said to have been Scottish, was killed in a mining accident. When he was in his early 20s, George heard news of Salvation Army meetings being held 5 miles away. Interested to see what they were about, George walked to the meetings, heard the gospel preached, and was converted. He became an evangelist, firstly with the Salvation Army, and then later with the Methodist Church. As an evangelist, he preached across America and Canada. It's said that he wrote the first verse of The Old Rugged Cross in Albion, Michigan, in the autumn of 1912, as a response to ridicule that he had received at a revival meeting. He had been heckled. He found that a difficult experience. These days have been described as a period of spiritual struggle in his life. Troubled by their disregard for the gospel, George turned to the Bible. He prayed for a full understanding of the cross. He later recalled, "I seemed to have a vision. I saw the Christ and the cross inseparable. It was like seeing John 3, verse 16, leave the printed page, take form, and act out the meaning of redemption." While watching this scene with my mind's eye, the theme of the song came to me, and with it the melody, but only words of the theme, the old rugged cross, and only the line, "I'll cherish the old rugged cross," came. But an inner voice seemed to say to me, "Wait." Over the months that followed, more lines came, and George would sing what he had written at various services, including at a church in Wisconsin. But it was back home that he eventually refined what he had written. The words seemed to just fall into place. He sent a copy of what he had written to Charles Gabriel, a hymn writer, the man who wrote "I Stand Amazed in the Presence of Jesus the Nazarene." Gabriel returned it to George with a prophetic statement: "You will hear from this song." When George then strummed his guitar and sang it to friends of his, Leroy Bostwick and his wife, they said, "God has given you a song that will never die. It has moved us as no other song has ever moved us." George said about their reaction that he had never seen anyone so genuinely moved as that couple. The Bostwicks actually paid for the hymn to be published. George himself said, "The words of the finished hymn were put into my heart in answer to my own need." He refused to take any credit for himself. He regarded himself as simply the instrument that God had used. There are various memorials to the song in America. Near where George lived in Albion, a sign that says "The Old Rugged Cross," one of the world's best loved hymns, was composed here in 1912 by George Bennard, the son of an Ohio coal miner. Bennard was a lifelong servant of God, chiefly in the Methodist ministry. He wrote the words and music of over 300 hymns. None achieved the fame of "The Old Rugged Cross," the moving summation of his faith. The finalised version was first sung in public in a church in Pokagon, Michigan. There's a plaque beside the church and indicates that during the revival it was sung publicly for the first time. And then there's the Old Rugged Cross Historical Museum. The hymn soon became popular. By 1939, more than 15 million copies of the hymn had been sold, and it remains popular today. when polls are taken to determine the most popular hymns, the Old Rugged Cross is often near the top of the list. It's been said to be one of the greatest hymns of the Christian church. It's also been said to be arguably the most beloved hymn of all time. It's been recorded by leading singers, among them George Beverly Shea, Jim Reeves, Johnny Cash, Elvis Presley. It has been sung in plays. It has been sung in TV programmes, including, maybe surprisingly, Doctor Who. We're thinking about the providence behind the cross. By the word providence, we mean God's overruling hand. George Bernard certainly believed that God was at work in giving him the words to his hymn. More than that, if the origin of the hymn can be traced back to opposition to his gospel preaching, persecution, we can see how God brought good out of bad. God is the divine alchemist. Alchemy was the ancient art of turning what was base into gold, and God has the unique ability to turn what seems bad into what is actually good. There's that verse in Romans 8 that Christians love. All things work together for good to them that love God. Here's another version of that same verse. We know that in all things, God works for the good of those who love him. Individual circumstances may not be pleasant. In fact, they may be painful, but the outcome will always be positive. Any number of examples of this truth in the Bible. Think of the story of Joseph in the Old Testament, in Genesis. Sold by his brothers. He faces the experience of the pit and then the prison before eventually the palace. Towards the end of the story, he says to his brothers, "Ye thought evil against me, but God meant it unto good." Now, it's not always easy. It's not always possible to see the good at the time. Often it only becomes apparent later. The supreme example is, of course, the cross, the crucifixion of Christ. Today is Good Friday, but what is good? What's so good about a man who dies on a cross? But the purpose became so clear later, and in the Acts of the Apostles, Christians were able to see in the actions of Herod and Pilate and the soldiers and the Jewish leaders, they were able to see behind all that the hand of God himself. God was in control in events in the life of his son. God was in control in events in the life of George Bernard. And God is in control in events in your life and in mine. The providence behind the hymn. But then the paradoxes in the hymn. There are paradoxes about the hymn. It seems that this hymn is both loved and loathed. Some dislike it because they think it sentimental. Others dislike it because they think it is bordering on the heretical, focusing, they would tell us, on the cross. But of course, when we're thinking about the cross of Christ, we are really thinking of the Christ of the cross. But there are paradoxes in the hymn. In verse 1, why would the dearest and best be slain? How could an emblem of suffering and shame be loved? In verse 2, how could the cross be despised by the world and yet delighted in by the Christian? In verse 3, an instrument of torture, a means of execution stained with blood, and yet the hymn writer speaks about a wondrous beauty. These paradoxes are explained. These apparent contradictions are resolved when we understand the message of the gospel. And the message is this: because the Lord Jesus suffered, we can be saved. Through his death, life for us. He went into the darkness so that we might be brought into marvellous light. He was stripped that we might be clothed with the garments of salvation. He was condemned that we might be cleared. He was punished that we might be pardoned. He was forsaken that we might be forgiven. Says the poet, that thou shouldst think so much on me, being the God thou art, is darkness to my intellect, but sunshine to my heart. And so we've thought about the providence behind the hymn, the paradoxes in the hymn, and then finally the price paid for the hymn. Just a couple of years after he wrote the hymn, in 1915, George Bernard sold the copyright to the song to Homer Rodeheafer for a payment of $500, foregoing future royalties to himself. And then upon the renewal of the copyright 28 years later, he received a final payment of $5,000. Two sums paid for the hymn, but those figures remind us of a greater, an infinitely greater price paid so that we could sing the hymn. The price paid by the Lord Jesus himself. The Bible tells us more than once, he gave himself. He paid the price with his blood. He paid the price with his life. George Bernard wrote more than 300 hymns, but not another of his hymn, not another hymn written by him, has had such an impact as this one. He died in 1958, and the hymn was sung at his funeral. Very appropriate for his hymn to be sung at his funeral, but very appropriate for his hymn to be sung at the funeral of any Christian. The hymn concludes with a fourth verse. He'll call me someday to my home far away, where his glory forever I'll share, so I'll cherish the old rugged cross. Till my trophies at last I lay down, I will cling to the old rugged cross and exchange it someday for a crown. I want to conclude this video in a very special way by sharing a recording of the hymn sung back in 1920 by Virginia Asher and Homer Rodeheafer, the man who acquired the copyright.
I will